Hello, I'm V.B. Price. I'm the editor of New Mexico Mercury. I'm here today in the Mercury's library with my dear friend Margaret Randall, the New Mexico Mercury's roving correspondent and international raconteur, and a writer and poet who is literally beloved the world over for her expansive generosity, deep curiosity, and her decades-long commitment to social justice and humanitarian sanity. The author of more than 120 books. Among her newest ones this year are a reminiscence of Che Guevara called Che on My Mind, due from Duke University Press this fall, a new collection of essays, More Than Things, from the University of Nebraska Press, and Daughters of Lady Jaguar Shark from Wings Press in San Antonio, Texas. It's so great to have you here with us today, Margaret. Thank you so much for coming.
It's wonderful to be here, Barrett, and it's wonderful to be in this room and to be doing this interview, to be having this conversation.
In this momentous and chaotic season at the Supreme Court, when affirmative action was undermined, where voting rights were gutted, where the equality of love and marriage were honored and to some extent protected, while in Texas, brutal anti-abortion laws were about to be passed, in such a week, the major issue, it seems to me, was left implicit but unspoken. The rights of women, feminism, and ubiquitous horrors of rape, incest, domestic violence. In this context, I would love it if you could talk to us a little bit about the explicit celebration of International Women's Day and your relationship to it and how it sort of strangely evolved in this country without ever being celebrated here.
It's interesting that you say it was implicit but not explicit. To me, it wasn't even implicit.
Okay.
I guess I'd like to start, before I talk about International Women's Day, to just talk a little bit about feminism in general, a word that seems to frighten a lot of people these days, even some women, and also somewhat annoy the corporate press since they are so clear that we are in a post-feminist moment. I just want to make it clear that for me, feminism is not about privileging women or hating men. It's a tool. It's a tool to help us understand power. And that goes for power between all peoples, any group of people, not just women, not just men, but true equality. And so, my feeling is that for millennia, women have been put down, shortchanged, repressed, oppressed, subdued. And what feminism, or the rise of what we call now the second wave of feminism, which started around 1969, 1970, what that did for women was two things. Those of us who embraced feminist thought were able to defy this millennial subjugation by the patriarchy in all political systems, in all regions, in all social classes, races, etc. And perhaps even more importantly, we were able to acquire our voice. We were able to tell our stories to each other, in the old consciousness-raising groups and so forth, and tell our stories to the world, because women traditionally have not had a voice. And so that's been really important. And so, as I say, feminism is a tool. It's an analytical tool to help us understand power, and it helps us understand the power differential between men and women, between big nations and small nations, and different groups of people, wealthy people and poor people, and so forth and so on. International Women's Day is really interesting, and as you said, it is ironic that it is based on something that was that happened in this country, just like International Workers' Day was based on the Haymarket affair in Chicago. And yet International Workers' Day is not celebrated in the United States. We have Labor Day, right? But it's celebrated throughout the world in, as I say, all kinds of political systems in every country except the United States. Well, the same is true of International Women's Day. International Women's Day goes back to, some say 1910, some women garment workers strikes in New York City, strikes for better working conditions. Other people say the Lowell, Massachusetts strikes in 1908. Whatever the case, women were rising up. Working women were striking for better salaries. I think at that point it was the 10-hour day that they were trying to acquire, to attain. And so they, so then in a few years later in Copenhagen at the meeting of the International Socialists, a woman named Clara Zetkin, who was a German revolutionary, proposed that we celebrate International Women's Day on March 8th. And again, based on something that happened in the United States and yet not celebrated in the United States, perhaps today celebrated in a few progressive communities, but certainly not. It's not the Mother's Day, you know, with the great consumerist opportunity for the establishment to make money. But in countries that I've lived in Mexico, in Cuba, in Nicaragua, International Women's Day is a great holiday. I don't want to say that those countries, you know, have that much of a better record than we do in terms of the treatment of women, because I can remember, for example, in Cuba, International Women's Day was fantastic. You know, in every workplace, men would make lunch for all their women colleagues and serve it to them with flowers on the trays and so forth and so on. But what about the other 364 days in the year, you know? So it is symbolic. It's symbolic like Mother's Day or Father's Day or Christmas or what have you. But it's a day that's always been very important to me. And my children know that if they don't send me a greeting, at least, for International Women's Day, that's not a good idea.
That's great. Margaret, you edited El Corno Emplumado in Mexico City for almost a decade, and as a poet and editor, you've had long experience with the existence of inequality in publishing, I would think, and in letters in general, where women have tended to sort of take the back seat in terms of publishing, unless they happen to have the misfortune of committing a glamorous suicide or something awful like that. Is this still the case, do you think?
It's an interesting question, a very interesting question. Traditionally, that's certainly been the case. And I remember even in the days that we published El Corno Emplumado, it was a groundbreaking magazine, a magazine I'm still very proud of. And yet we published far fewer women than men. Mm-hmm. It was just the sign of the times. We didn't even notice it, you know?
Yeah.
Someone who's done a really interesting study, it was back in the 70s, but it's not so out of date, sadly, was Tilly Olson. You know, the great American writer of working women in the Midwest and so forth. She did a book, and I can't remember exactly the date, sometime in the 70s, called Silences. And I've taught that book. And it has a great many statistics, I wish I could remember some of them, about women taught in literature classes, women poets as opposed to male poets taught in the universities, women getting prizes like the National Book Award, women getting grants like the Guggenheim or the Rockefeller or the NEA, as compared with men. Women in anthologies, poetry anthologies, you know, the great old anthologies, the Heath anthology, the Norton, and so forth. There were very few women. Yeah. And, it has gotten better. It definitely has gotten better. And I think feminism is partially responsible for the fact that it's gotten better. And today, I would venture to say that there are as many, if not more, exciting women poets in the United States than there are men. I mean, not that I'm forgetting about some of our wonderful male poets. And the exciting thing about poetry today in the United States is that Black women, Hispanic women, Latino women, Asian women, women with disabilities, very young women, slam poets, hip hop poets, performance poets, page poets. What I'm supposed to be a page poet, right? Our generation is is that's what we've been consigned to. But among the poets, the exciting poets published today in the United States, many, many, many of them are women. And of course, it started out like everything in a market economy. Oh, let's get our token lesbian of the season, or our token African American woman poet of the season, or whatever. But the sheer force and power of these women's voices has broken through that, so that today you have, Joy Harjo, you have Adrienne Rich, you have Sonia Sanchez, you have, I could go on and on, but you have a solid roster of names of women poets. And again, because of feminism, I think women are speaking out of our experience, and it's a complex experience and a profound experience. So we're not writing the same old dewdrop on the edge of the railing poems. We're writing about what we've lived and what we live, and so that's all part of the picture.
So do you think then it's possible that women poets are beginning to sort of lead a kind of an evolution, an opening to the reality of the horrors and the trauma that many, many women face in our society and in society around the world? I know that we were talking a while back, and it was, you used the term, I believe, traumatizing a whole society when one half of your population is almost uniformly subjected to one kind of degradation or abuse after another. Is it possible that these new poetic voices are opening this up to actually see what's there and perhaps do something about it finally?
They are, Barrett. They are. But not only them. Women novelists, women screenwriters, women who are writing song lyrics, who are involved in all the arts, scholars, women scholars who have done these extraordinary studies. I mean, I think of someone like Judith Lewis Herman at Harvard, who wrote so many years ago now, I guess in the early 90s, Trauma and Recovery.
Right.
This was the first book for many of us, and I guess the first book, really, I don't know of another, that defined violence against women, the violence, the routine, everyday violence, the pandemic of violence that women experience. She likened it to what we used to call shell shock, and today we call, post-traumatic stress, yes, suffered by soldiers coming home from the battlefield. It's the same type of violence that produces a situation in which people are made crazy. Women and men are made crazy. They take on very often the attributes, the attitudes and actions of their abusers. They are so frightened that they don't know how to leave their abusers in many cases. I mean, the statistics are mind-blowing. We see every once in a while the tip of the iceberg, such as this recent hullabaloo about 26,000 women in the U.S. military, reporting sexual abuse by their superiors or their fellow officers, male officers. If 26,000 women have reported this, we know what a hostile environment the military is for this kind of reporting. It does not encourage it. It punishes it. And so we know that it's much higher than that. The CDC estimates that 1.3 million women a year in this country alone are raped. And that the chance of a woman being raped during her lifetime is 1 in 5. Those statistics seem very low to me. But at least, we have those statistics. We have sort of an incipient recognition of this, but it never goes far enough. When we think of the economic violence against women in this country, women earn 77% of what men earn, and women are now graduating from universities and colleges at a rate that's higher than their male students, and yet that hasn't changed. That hasn't closed the gender gap, and we think of this. Some people tend to think of these things as women's problems or women's issues, but they're issues and problems that affect the entire society, because when we understand that 64% of women in this country are either heads of households, that is, they are the wage earners, the sole wage earners, or their salaries are necessary along with their male partners in order to sustain their families, then we can see that economic violence against women affects everybody. It affects the family, it affects the children, it affects society as a whole. And this is reproduced in every area. It's reproduced in education, in healthcare, and of course, violence against women is probably the most, outright violence. I mean, we call all of these things violence. I call all of these things violence. But when I think of, the sort of the root evil violence, it's rape, it's incest, it's battery, it's domestic, what we tend to call domestic violence. So it is a pandemic, and bits and pieces of this picture are being explored. They're being addressed, from time to time. But when you introduced this conversation, you mentioned the appalling situation in Texas, where the Texas legislature and many others now, the governor of Ohio, I think yesterday, just also made it much more difficult for women in his state to exercise their choice or to get an abortion. It goes on and on and on, and it affects us all, and it's really intolerable.
It is.
It's something that we're going to have to face up to, like we're going to have to face up to climate change. It's that big to me.
It is. When I was a reporter at the Tribune in the 60s, I used to be a police reporter, and I would go to the police station every morning at about 3 o'clock, and I would look at the blotter, and I would see many, many rapes that I was not allowed to report because this was a family newspaper. And I was a 26-year-old American male. I was writing some poems in those days, but I really didn't understand. But seeing and feeling that admonition not to report an evident, obvious, monstrous truth, that it was simply off the charts, you couldn't talk about it, finally opened my eyes to some things. I'm not exactly sure what the exact cause and effect relationships are, but we still have this suppression of this reality. I mean, a 77%, a 33% differential in wages, sometimes much higher than that, 50% oftentimes.
Oh, yeah.
In legal offices and all, it's just unbelievable. I mean, it's like, it's like the institution of it's institutional penury, and yet it's still suppressed. How do we lift that? How do we lift the roof off of that thing? How do we do that? I mean, obviously, talking about it helps, but is there more?
Talking about it does help, and of course, legal action helps more, and judgments and law and so forth. But education, I think language is really important, and I'm probably hooked into this because of being a poet, and language is so important to me. It occurs to me that when they told you couldn't report those cases because it was a family newspaper, they were also saying, or not saying, but they also meant, that's not news because it's personal, it's private. And in our language, we have many, I think of them as extremely ugly sayings. One of them is, boys will be boys, and men will be men. We sort of, in our society, we want to excuse those kinds of actions, violent action on the part. And, I should say, as we're talking about this, that it's not only women who are abused, who suffer this violence. Men often suffer it. And it's not only men who are the abusers. There are many women who are also abusers, although it's overwhelmingly male on female violence. And this is one of the reasons why I don't like to think of this in terms of individual men. I'd like to think of it as systemic. I mean, patriarchy is a system. It's a system that has been operative for many thousands of years, with some exceptions in matriarchal societies and so forth. And it's a system that affects everyone. If it's important for men to show their manliness or their worth by being strong and tough and not crying and dominating the women and children in their lives and so forth, then it hurts their humanity. Sure. And it hurts the women who they're harming. Absolutely. Absolutely. So it's something that affects the whole society. So rather than talk about he did this or although I think it's important in rape cases and incest cases and so forth to name the abuser, to give him a first and last name. I think it's much more useful to combat patriarchy as a system that in our particular country and in this time is intermeshed with capitalism and a consumer society in very intricate ways. Yeah. These are not crimes of nobody against nobody. The people who commit these crimes have interests to protect. Yeah. It's very often about money. Yeah. It's very often economic. The man is in control, economically as well as every other way, or he wants to think he is. And the woman, very often in some of these domestic violence situations, don't feel that they can leave the man because perhaps he's supporting her and her children. Yes, yes. So economics comes into it, sociology comes into it, all kinds of things come into it. And it's important, I think, to look at these issues in a way that allows us to understand the different forces at work and how they play upon each other. Yes, it's the intersection. It's the intersection where these things have to be worked out.
So it's this intersection that really fascinates me, and I've never heard anybody talk about it that way before. And I think it's a wonderful way to look at, to start to look at the strange sort of seeming disinterest, uninterest from younger people in these issues, particularly in issues of power differential, which I think many of them honestly don't really think exist anymore. And I don't mean just women, but I don't think young men think they exist anymore either. So to talk about the patriarchy is a liberating way to think about it, because you take the power of accusation off of it, because although the patriarchy has tremendous, vast, actual, concrete impacts, it is an abstraction, and so it's much easier to dissect and analyze. So how do we get younger people now? This is kind of a rambling question, but how do we get younger people interested in that intersection again?
Yeah, that's clearly the $64,000 question. And I can't pretend to have the answer. When I see young women, especially when I hear young women saying that, they don't need to be feminists anymore because it's all resolved and so forth, I'm both deliriously happy and very, very sad.
Oh.
I'm happy because obviously our generation did enough so that they're in a position where they do feel that they have more agency, more voice, more power. But I'm very, very sad because it's a very thin perception.
Yeah.
And, I don't think that it's my place as a almost 77-year-old woman to tell young women, how they're going to have to work this out. I have confidence that they are going to work it out. They're going to push it forward. They may not work it completely out, but they're going to push this struggle forward just like we did in our generation. But I'm interested that you feel the patriarchy is abstract. And actually, you taught me a lot when you said that. And you've made me think about something. Well, is patriarchy really abstract? It's not to me. Because to me, patriarchy is very, very concrete. And it's evidenced in 100,000 historic moments. The conclaves in early Christianity when women were just written out of power.
You wrote a wonderful poem about
by the church, and the church in this sense still a very powerful institution in the world. All you have to do is look at any gathering of, the U.S. government, the U.S. House of Representatives, the Senate, or the European Union, or any of these. Yeah, there are a few women. But most of them are men in suits and ties. Most of them are white men in suits and ties. Of course, if you go to the Arabic countries, most of them are Arabic men, and they don't wear suits and ties, but it's the same thing, So all of these pictures, all of these images and what they represent speak to me about very concrete moments, very concrete examples of how patriarchy has operated, is operating, and will operate, and how incredibly desperate it is to retain its power. I mean, this is concrete to them as well.
Sure.
It means an extra $5 or $6 million a year, or $20 or $30 million a year, to keep the status quo. So the whole issue of war, we haven't talked about war, but it is such a male idea, and not that some women don't subscribe to it, but it's such a worthless, useless, hideous way of getting rid of population, and what population are we getting rid of? Mostly young people, and in that case, mostly men, who are the cannon fodder for these tyrants' ideas and power grabbing actions. So when I hear the word patriarchy, I realize, as I say, you've taught me something in that question, because I realize how it can sound abstract to many people. But when I hear that word, I think of every one of these instances, every one of these historic moments, every one of these moments in which women have lost their humanity. And as I say, if women lose our humanity, humanity loses its humanity.
So I guess what I was sort of aiming at with that word abstraction is if you look at the word patriarchy, you look at the word capitalism, you look at the word war. What you obviously have to do, as you say, is look underneath those words and see what actually is happening. We never end wars, I think largely because we don't look at them very much if we can possibly help it. So is one of the strategies to for the future to bring out and bring up into consciousness these things that we can't bear to see?
I so love that question, Barrett. That's one of the reasons I love you. I mean, that is such an important question because it really teaches us that we can't use these buzzwords anymore. You know, patriarchy may mean one thing to me, it means something else to somebody else. Capitalism means different things to different people. Democracy, you know, it means a whole lot of different things to different people. And there were many kinds of democracy. Communism, socialism, revolution, war, all of these words have been bastardized intentionally by the corporate media to, A, make us think that we all know what each other is talking about when we're using those words, which is the first mistake. And it puts people off. It turns people off. You know, I think young people today, they don't want to hear those words, and they're absolutely right. I think my generation ran those words into the ground, and we didn't ask enough questions. We didn't ask our political leaders or our religious leaders or our leaders, you know. We didn't ask the people we admired, well, what do you mean by that? Yes. You know, exactly what do you mean when you say da-da-da-da-da? We just accepted it, you know, and we thought we all were on the same page. And that's not necessarily true. So I think one of the things that we need to do today, if there's something that we need to do to encourage younger people to pick up where we're leaving off, is to urge them to ask questions, to urge them not to accept things on face value, to urge them to try to understand what is meant by the words they use to the people who are listening to those words. I think that's a great beginning.
Margaret, I do too. I think that's exactly what we all have to do, particularly those of us of our age. This is perhaps the last gift we can give, is to try and say what's really there behind those facades. Thank you so much for today. This has been thrilling and exciting, and I'm so grateful to you for being here with us.
I'm also very grateful for this conversation because, like all good conversations, it's taught me a lot. And it occurs to me, just one last thing, you know, you talk about the last gift that we can give. Maybe the last gift that we can really give is to listen to the next generation.